All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jeffrey Weidlinger. I'm the director of the Jean and Samuel Center for Judaic Studies here at the University of Michigan. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Zvi Gitelman, who is the Preston R. Tisch Professor of Judaic Studies and Professor of Political Science. I first became acquainted with the work of Professor Gitelman when I was an undergraduate student at McGill University in Montreal. I was developing an interest in Russian history and was rummaging through one of my favorite used bookstores in Montreal's Old City when I came across a stack of Zvi's book, A Century of Ambivalence, which they were actually selling as remainders. It was probably the most important $10 I ever spent on picking up one of those books. And it was a big book with a lot of pictures, which I was a sophomore at the time, so lots of pictures appealed to me, and they were wonderful pictures. And I went through the book and we really became fascinated in it and started shifting my interests away from just Russian history to the history of Jews in the Russian Empire. Intrigued by this book and by some other things of Zvi's that I read at the time, I applied for graduate school at the University of Michigan. But when acceptances came, I got a thin envelope and instead ended up going to Georgetown University, where I did my degree. I didn't imagine then that some 20 years later, I guess just 20 years later, I would have the privilege of working with Zvi as a colleague. And it really has been a privilege to work with him over the 4 years that I've been working here with him and over the 20 years or so that I've had the opportunity to learn from him in a variety of settings. Professor Gitelman is one of the foremost scholars of Soviet Jewry. The field which you've just heard has seen a flourishing in the last 10 to 20 years, is arguably now one of the most vibrant fields in Jewish studies. I have yet, however, to read a book that matches the influence, erudition, and originality of Zvi's 1972 Jewish nationality in Soviet politics. Written before access to Soviet archives was possible, and during a period in which American scholarship was highly politicized by Cold War battles, Zvi presented a remarkably nuanced and revisionist account of the Jewish experience in the Soviet Union. In his reading, the early revolutionary years were neither the culmination of Jewish political achievement nor the result of unbridled oppression, but rather represented a failed attempt at cultural, intellectual, and political rebirth. This notion that the early years of Jewish life in the Soviet Union were constructive as well as destructive continues to inform scholarship on the topic over 40 years after Zvi first made that observation. Zvi's subsequent works have been equally influential. In his 1997 Bitter Legacy, Confronting the Holocaust in the USSR, he initiated a whole new direction of scholarship on both the Holocaust and the Soviet Union. Zvi showed that the Soviet government did not completely suppress knowledge of the Holocaust as had previously been assumed, but rather reinterpreted the Holocaust to conform to a broader Soviet intellectual framework. Once again, the myriad of books on the Holocaust in the Soviet Union that keep appearing every year have only reinforced Zvi's original observations. More recently, Zvi authored a book that was the result of a decade of surveys among post-Soviet Russian and Ukrainian Jews about their attitudes toward Jewish identity and Judaism. This sobering account shows that while some post-Soviet Jews have taken on aspects of Jewish identity, it is what Zvi called a thin identity and is unlikely to be sustained in future generations, he wrote. Zvi arrived at the University of Michigan 49 years ago, during which time he was integral in establishing the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies. He remains engaged in charitable and professional organizations around the country, including the Joint Distribution Committee, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, and the Blavatnik Archive. For many, though, Zvi is admired most as a teacher. Since announcing this talk, I've received many comments from those who have been fortunate enough to study with him over the years. All recall his sense of humor and his high expectations. One student who took a graduate seminar with Zvi recalled his generosity, how he would invite students to his house, where he would regale them with stories of the declining standards of university admissions. I'll note, by the way, that this former student graduated some 30 years ago. I'm sure Zvi thinks that the situation has improved since then, though. Some other comments that we received from former students and colleagues are, and I'll just give a few quotes here, quote, "A favorite professor indeed. His courses and conversations are bright spots in the bright chapter of life that is college." Another student wrote, "He made a difference to me as a student and as an adult in viewing the world differently." Another student wrote, "Zvi Gitelman has been a role model, mentor, teacher, and friend to all of us." Another one wrote, "Mazel tov," and this is actually my favorite, wrote, "Mazel tov to Professor Gitelman on his retirement. I remember him fondly as an outstanding professor and for his habit of heckling me when he passed me on his bicycle." I know that Zvi is currently working on at least 2 new books by my count, and will have many years ahead of scholarship, bicycling, and heckling. Zvi has asked that we not follow this talk with a question and answer session, so immediately after Zvi's remarks, I invite everybody to join us for a reception across the hall, just over there, where we will hear from a few other colleagues, friends, and students of Zvi. So now, please join me in welcoming Zvi Gitelman to reflect on politics, history, and a half century at Michigan.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Looks like it's a pretty slow night in Ann Arbor. But thank you all for coming. And Anya, this is not the same tie. That very generous introduction by my friend and colleague, Jeff Weidlinger, reminds me of a story of a Hasidic Rebbe on a Sabbath afternoon. His acolytes are gathered around him. He is lost in thought, paying no attention to what's going on in the room, clearly communing with the Almighty, deep in mystical cogitation and contemplation. But he's being introduced by one of his followers, who is going on and on about the virtues of this rabbi. He's pious, he's smart, he's learned, he understands human beings, he knows the texts backwards and forwards, and he goes on and on and on. But the Rebbe is paying no attention, stroking his beard. Finally, the introduction ends. And the Rebbe turns to the person who is introducing him and he says, "And about my modesty, you say nothing?" I want to thank you all for coming, and thank especially Anya Sternschis, Todd Endelman, David Fishman, and Jeff Weidlinger, who organized this event, for participating in this event, and of course to thank the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies, the Center for Russian and East European Studies, and the Political Science Department, who have all joined in this. I've been asked to reflect on politics, history, and a half a century at Michigan, and I'm happy to do so. So the first question is, how does a kid from the East Bronx get to Ann Arbor, Michigan? The answer is very simple. He buys a car, the first in his family. It's a Peugeot 404, never been seen in Michigan before. 1968 model, cost $2,600, and he drives to Ann Arbor. But it's more complicated. My parents were immigrants and refugees. My father came from Pinsk, which is now in Belarus, was then in the Russian Empire. I'm not sure why, but I do know that in 1919, when my father was 11, the Polish legionaries took temporary control, actually it turned out to be longer, of the city. There was a civil war going on, the Bolsheviks, the whites, the Poles, the Ukrainians. It was the eve of Passover, and Jews were sitting in the great synagogue of Pinsk, dividing up the parcels which had come from their landslide, from the people, the other Pinskers in America. And the Polish legionaries dragged them out of the synagogue, lined them up against the wall, and shot 35 of them, accusing them of being Bolsheviks. In 1920, and I'm not sure of the causal relationship, my grandfather came to New York, worked as a furrier, and I think probably told an untruth on the affidavit, which I have, which says that I have $10,000 and I am able to bring over my wife and 4 children and support them. Be that as it may, they came in 1921. My mother was a 7th-generation Palestinian Jew, born in the Ottoman Empire, but she and her family were also driven out of Jerusalem in 1929 by Arab rioters. So I consider myself the son of a Palestinian refugee. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a trilingual home, Hebrew, Yiddish, and English, but I've always been aware of what might have been and grateful to this country of immigrants. I want to tell you about my college tour. I often see groups on the Diag being led by a very enthusiastic undergraduate praising this great university as I ride my bike by the group. My college tour was done by subway. First, I got off at 137th Street and Broadway and walked around City College of New York, where my father thought I should go, because after all, he'd gotten his BA and his MA there for nothing, tuition free. He had come to the United States at age 13, started in PS 6 in the Bronx in the 1st grade, and by the end of that school year, he'd finished the 6th grade. But I continued on the subway 2 stops further down, got off at Columbia, walked around the campus, and I was sold. The question was, how could I possibly afford the $900 annual tuition at the college? So I made a deal with my father. I would work in the summer, and I would make at least $350. The New York State Regents Scholarship was worth about $250 or $300, and the rest, about $300, if my parents could pay, I could go. And that's what happened. My first class at college was called Contemporary Civilization. Great class, great Columbia tradition. The name of the young instructor was Andrew Martin. So there were 17 guys in the class. 15 of us, myself included, failed the midterm. The question was about the Magna Carta. And we'd all had civics in high school, and we read the Magna Carta, and we knew that this was a great step forward in the history of democracy, and that's what we wrote. And he handed back all the Fs, and he said, read the document. Who benefited from it? Oh. But I got my revenge against Andy Martin. His son, Daniel, became a student at the University of Michigan. And Daniel had become an Orthodox Jew. Ha! Served Andy Martin right. Now imagine my consternation 3 years ago when the University of Michigan announced that Andrew Martin would become the 18th dean of the College of LS&A. He would have the last laugh. But I quickly did the math, and I figured out that if it was the same Andy Martin, he'd be 110 years old. And thankfully, he's not. So thank you, Dean Martin, for coming. My father didn't talk about his life during the First World War, the Russian Revolution, and the Civil War of 1918, 1921. And of course, that made me ever more curious about Russia and Eastern Europe. I grew up during the Cold War. I was fascinated by Stalin and what he was purported to do, which he actually did. But my best subject in high school was English, so in college I decided to be an English literature major and had a wonderful course in 17th and 18th century English literature. But by the end of the course, I said, do I really want to be an English major and study the influence of the toilet habits of Daniel Defoe on the writings of Moll Flanders? little did I suspect how the study of literature would become even more arcane in later years. One of my students here at the university came back from a year in England. She was an English major, and she told me she had had a great year. I said, "What's so great? What was so great about your year in England?" She said, "Well, you know, I took 2 years of English lit at Michigan, and all they did was rail against the canon and criticize the canon. When I got to England, I finally read the canon. It's terrific." So searching for a major, I took a course in East European politics, Government 52, I wouldn't say taught, it was magically spun out by Joseph A. Rothschild. And like almost all of my mentors at Columbia, he was born in Europe. I loaded up, this was the second half of my junior year, I loaded up on Russian language and literature, Soviet politics, foreign policy, political science. Later I studied Polish. I went on to graduate study at Columbia, and in 1966, while writing my dissertation, I taught at the college. Now, my friend and colleague Andy Markovitz, who's sitting here, claims that I had the nerve, the chutzpah, to give him a B+ when he was a student at Columbia. Being somewhat of a pack rat, I looked it up. It's not on a computer. Andy was never my student, and besides, I wouldn't have given him as high a grade as a B+. So in '68, Columbia offered me an assistant professorship with a salary of $7,500, which was about $4,000 more than I thought I needed. But the chairman of the department gave me some excellent advice. He said, "Look, you'll be here for years, and people will still think that you're Zbigniew Brzezinski's student from the 1960s. Now, it was an honor to be a student of Zbigniew Brzezinski. In fact, I'll tell you a little story. The late Professor Brzezinski was so smart that the aim of our graduate seminar was to get him. And we would gather before the class and say, okay, how can we stop Zbig and really nail him to the wall this time? So it was my turn, and Brzezinski made a statement in class, and he said, "In the 20th century, peasant parties cannot succeed. They're an anachronism, they can never come to power. Professor, there's an exception, even if you're right. In Israel, the Labor Party is the dominant party, and the ministers of the government from the Labor Party go home on weekends to their kibbutzim, to their agricultural colonies, and they milk the cows, and they wash the dishes, and they pluck the fruit in the fields." And Brzezinski looks at me and he says, "Mr. Gitelman, just because you go to the Catskills for the weekend, it doesn't make you a peasant." So when Michigan offered me $10,000 to come and teach East European politics, and my graduate colleague and friend Bill Zimmerman was already teaching here, I accepted. My mother wasn't quite sure where Michigan is, but my father had a cousin in Ann Arbor. He was one of 3 brothers, orphaned during World War I, who were brought over to New York and adopted by the family in Brooklyn. Cousin Scheike, known in Brooklyn as Seymour, couldn't find a job in the Depression, certainly not in the fur business, which was the family business. So he took a WPA job in Michigan. He became a prison guard. And by 1952, he was deputy warden of Jackson State Prison, the same year that they had a major riot. Seymour Gitelman was told, "Change your name if you want to get ahead. That's far too Jewish." So Seymour Gitelman became S.J. Gilman. He, in fact, invented the system in the state of Michigan of minimum security prisons which were engaged in conservation work. And there's a women's camp named Camp Gilman for him. So that's how an older cousin from Brooklyn and a younger cousin from the Bronx got to Ann Arbor. What a great move. What dumb luck. I met my wife Marlene here, a native of working-class Detroit. Our children were born here, and I joined a department that has been just a great home in the broader sense of the word. This was a department that was founded in 1910. It was in the early 1960s that the first Jew was accepted in the department. A longtime member of the department, a Catholic, told me that Catholics would not be hired by the department unless they were in political theory. Aquinas, Augustine, they can do that. But other than that, forget it. And here I was, accepted without question. I've learned so much in this department. I've served under 12 chairpersons. I looked at their pictures the other day. Every single one was an outstanding scholar, a teacher, and an administrator. I've had wonderful colleagues on whom I could always rely for advice, knowledge, support, and new ideas. As many have noted over the decades, the political science department at Michigan has not only consistently been one of the very best, but it's been free of factionalism, intra-departmental wars, and has accepted very different approaches and methods, and created a stimulating and supportive institution over many decades. It is a department that is in the most profound sense of a much abused word, diverse. The department did give me a lot of time off so I could go and teach and do research in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, in Budapest and Prague, in Moscow and Warsaw, at Princeton and Harvard, at Penn and in New York. And I'm very grateful for that. But I must say, I wondered sometimes, why was the department so happy to see me go? I had come from a very traditional department at Columbia. In fact, it was called the Department of Public Law and Government. And I had come to a department which had pioneered in the study of political behavior. I took advantage. I audited a course on survey research given by Warren Miller, and Herb Eagle and I together sat in a course on elementary Czech. Through the Center for Russian and East European Studies, I've interacted with a remarkable group of historians, social scientists, and linguists with whom I share a deep interest in what was then the communist world. My fellow Columbia graduate students, the late Mike Oxenberg, Ken Lieberthal, eminent specialists in China, joined the department later, and so the comparative study of communism flourished at Michigan. Bill Zimmerman remains a wise counselor and critic and a good friend. The late Al Meyer was a wonderful interlocutor. Chris Aiken, who defected to Princeton some years ago, John Jackson, guided me through the basic mysteries of statistics and methods. And I've always enjoyed my discussions with Arlene Saxonhouse about political theory and, incidentally, about departmental politics. My earlier research and publications were in East European politics. I co-edited and contributed to books in that area with the economist Morris Bornstein, political scientist Bill Zimmerman, Walter Connor, a sociologist. But in 1970, the late Herb Paper, who was a linguist and a specialist in Iranian and Judeo-Persian languages, together with Edna Coffin, who taught modern Hebrew language, we got together and we requested from the Detroit Jewish Welfare Federation a grant to provide funds for the introduction of Judaic studies at Michigan. We weren't trying to create an ethnic advocacy program, but a program for the serious scholarly study and teaching of Jewish history, culture, and languages, of contemporary Jewry, and of the Jewish state, Israel. The Federation responded positively. They gave us $40,000. What did we use that $40,000 for? it sufficed to pay a young Jewish historian for 3 years. That was Yehuda Reinhartz, who later became president of Brandeis University, where I believe he was paid more than $40,000 over 3 years. I should note that at that time, the $40,000 was less than the football coach was being paid at that time. As I think David Fishman mentioned a while ago, I had become personally involved in the campaign to free Soviet Jews from state and societal discrimination and to allow them to emigrate. I kept a low profile. I didn't sign petitions because as a Russian speaker, I felt I was pretty or comparatively valuable in the ability to go to the Soviet Union and meet with people. In 1985, Marlene and I accompanied 110 Michigan alumni on a cruise. It's the only cruise we've ever taken. It was on the Dnieper River. Bet you've never done that. Caribbean, schmarabian. And we went down from Russia to Ukraine, then to Bulgaria and Romania. And on the cruise, we met a woman who had graduated Michigan in the class of 1936 and her husband, Jean and Samuel Frankel. We formed a very close personal friendship. And we introduced this middle-aged couple quite stealthily to refuseniks, Jews who had been denied permission to emigrate, had lost their jobs, and were constantly being harassed by authorities. And we sneaked into their apartments. They were very impressed. I remember once a young man was teaching the text of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible. But such books were not available in the Soviet Union. Photocopying was impossible. You had to have a need to know. You had to have permission to use a photocopying machine. And that was granted by state authorities. This young man had taken an ordinary camera and had photographed the pages of the Bible. And then somehow it was reproduced on very thick paper, and it's from that text that the lesson was being taught. Sam and Jean, Marlene and I, were very impressed by the effort that had been made. We'd met a couple who were desperate to emigrate, but the husband was denied permission to do so because, as a trumpeter in the Soviet army, he had access to military secrets. Presumably, you know, how you blow taps on Monday and how you do it on Wednesday. So he was refused. Well, I gave a talk at the American Jewish Committee in New York once, and luckily in the audience was the Assistant Secretary of State for Humanitarian and Human Affairs, Richard Shifter. And Dick Shifter had himself been a refugee from Nazi-occupied Vienna. And he liked the talk, and he invited me to come down to the State Department where we met. And he asked me at the end of the meeting, he said, "Is there anything I could do for you?" And I said, "Yeah." The next time Secretary Kissinger goes to Moscow, and I know he's going in a couple of months, there's this couple in Moscow who are being detained for no obvious reason. Could you ask the secretary to intervene with the Soviet authorities and ask them to let them go? It happened, and we were fortunate enough to meet them in Israel a few months later. This friendship with the Frankels that we struck up on this 1985 cruise continued into the next generation with Stanley and Judy Frankel. And in 1988, the Frankel family established the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies, and later, the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies. And I had by then learned a very important lesson, which was how to deal with Stanley Frankel. I learned it from Jean, his mother. She did a much better job than I. The expansion of Judaic studies at Michigan spurred me to combine my interest in communist politics and Russian and East European Jewry, and most of my research, as you've heard before, in recent decades has been in that area. And that meant turning in part to history, though my most recent monograph, as you heard, was an empirical study based on 7,000 surveys in Russia and Ukraine about how people conceive of their ethnicity. And I discovered that both American and Russian-speaking Jews were confused, were uncertain, as I called it in the subtitle, an uncertain ethnicity about what it meant to be Jewish and what were the behavioral implications of that identity. I'd been teaching a course in the poli-sci department on ethnicity and politics, and so I immersed myself in the literature on ethnic and religious identity. And I noticed that parallel searches for identity were going on among Russians after 1991. They were no longer Soviets, and they had to figure out, what does it mean to be a Russian? Among Moldovans, who had suddenly become Moldovans and not Romanians, perhaps, certainly among Belarusians and among some Ukrainians. So figuring out what your nation is and what your affiliations imply for your social and political activities is a big issue in the post-communist Europe. I also became immersed in the study of the World War II and the Holocaust in the USSR, which has suddenly emerged not just as a study or as a subject in academia, as the previous panel discussed. It's a highly politicized subject, and from my political science point of view, it intrigues me. That subject was assiduously avoided in some of the countries of Eastern Europe because it raised all kinds of sensitivities, of collaboration, of complicity, of responsibility, and what that meant for subsequent generations of the peoples of the area. Fellowships at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, at the Yad Vashem Institute in Israel, along with collaboration on a project about Jewish resistance in the ghettos with my graduate school friend, my colleague, my co-author Lenore Weitzman, brought me to history and the politics of doing historical research and presenting it. And I'd like to turn to that topic briefly. It's obvious that my research and teaching has straddled history and political science. And as my friend Ron Sunni just told me in the hall, he thinks that history is social science and that the boundary between the two is artificial. I actually was first introduced to this notion by Professor Henry Roberts, one of my teachers in graduate school. And we noticed that Henry Roberts had 2 doctoral degrees. PhD, Yale, 1939, DPhil, Oxford, 1950. Gee, Roberts must be a genius. So one day we asked him, how come? He said, well, my Yale PhD was on medieval church history, so I knew Latin. So when the war came, the army said, Latin, isn't that related to Romanian? Okay, Roberts, you're assigned to the Allied Control Commission in Bucharest, because you'll pick up Romanian from Latin. Roberts found Romania so interesting that on the GI Bill, he went to Oxford, and he wanted to write a dissertation in history on interwar Romania. Oh no, you can't do that, sir. After 1815 and Waterloo, everything is political science, not history. We don't have the data. So he wrote this wonderful book on interwar Romania. I've been lucky to be a direct witness of significant political history. In the late 1960s, Bill Zimmerman and Ron might remember this, at the annual Russian Institute party, we were able to shake the hand of Alexander Kerensky, the chairman of the provisional government in 1917, which succeeded the Tsar. And Kerensky would sit in the corner, and all these eager beaver graduate students would come up to him and say, "Kerensky, you didn't think I was still alive, I had long discussions in Warsaw with Hirsch Smolar, leader of the Jewish underground in the Minsk ghetto in World War II, a partisan, and later the editor of the Yiddish-Polish newspaper Volksstimme. In 1968, Ron Suni and I witnessed the student demonstrations at Columbia, I think perhaps from different angles, and subsequent police actions. A year later, I was walking hurriedly at night through the deserted streets of Prague because there was a general strike called unofficially, but very effective, to mark the first anniversary of the Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia in '68. There was no public transportation available. I was in Mala Strana, one side of Prague, and I had to go back to Vinohrady on the other side of Prague. There was water cannon and tear gas in the streets. No big deal, except I had a briefcase. And in the briefcase were the mimeographed papers of a seminar largely conducted by political scientists designing a new political model for Czechoslovakia. It had been commissioned by the government in '66, but the papers could not be published. And the man who gave me the papers asked that I take it out to the West because who knows what might happen. With Marlene's innocent and unsuspecting help, we got the papers out. The man who gave me the papers was Peter Pitart. In 1990, after the Velvet Revolution and the fall of communism, Pitart became the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic. And maybe 3-4 years ago, he came to Ann Arbor. And I showed him the papers, and he said, "Where in the world did you get that?" I said, "From you, in Prague, '69. I was in Moscow in 1991, when opponents of Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms mounted an unsuccessful coup d'etat. So I've been, let's say, a very minor witness to history. Some years ago, someone observed in a department meeting, probably one presided over by Don Kinder, who made department meetings an absolutely joyous and riotous and comedic occasion. Someone observed that we had strong connections with the departments of economics, sociology, statistics, and psychology, but none to history. So thankfully that changed when Ron Suni returned from exile at the University of Chicago and came back to teach history here. And I've cherished my relations with historians, him, Todd Endelman, Yehuda Reinhartz, Bill Rosenberg, Roman Sporluk, and now, of course, Jeff Weidlinger. History and politics are, of course, intertwined. The Soviet historian M.N. Pakrovsky observed in 1932, history is politics projected into the past. Nowhere was that more true than in communist countries, where people would cynically say that the future is easy to predict. Comrades, it's only the past that is always changing. In those regimes, leaders were well aware, as George Orwell wrote, that, quote, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." Our friend, the friend of many of us, Sam Cassow, at Trinity College, recently told us an anecdote about last month's centennial celebration of the Russian Revolution in Moscow. 2017, big military parade, soldiers, tanks, artillery. And it's being observed from above by Caesar, Hannibal, and Napoleon. Caesar looks down and he says, if I only had that artillery, I would have won all the wars. Hannibal says, had I only had those tanks instead of elephants, Carthage would have defeated Rome. Napoleon is saying nothing. He's leafing through back issues of Pravda. And finally he sighs and he says, if only I had had Pravda, no one would have ever even heard of Waterloo. In the United States, as I've often told my students, and they've proved the point admirably, historical memory goes back to the day before yesterday. Americans look to the future more than to their relatively brief past. In Europe, on the other hand, there may be a surfeit of memory. Possibly the most famous Michigander of all, Henry Ford, said, "History is bunk." In 1916, a man who interviewed Ford reported, quote, "To facts which I submitted, he responded with a brief word of dismissal or with a sweeping denial that they were facts at all, sometimes with the remark that he could not consider them because he himself did not know them to be facts." Mr. Ford said he didn't believe in history. History was of the past and had no bearing upon the present, and that there being nothing to be learned from it, history need not be studied and need not be considered. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Ford also published the 4-volume The International Jew and sponsored the English publication of the Tsarist forgery, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. In 1938, the Nazi government in Germany gave Ford its highest civilian decoration. So I wouldn't take Ford's views on history or politics too seriously. Today, in the former communist countries, history and its interpretation are very politicized. Serbs remain agitated and are moved even to killing people by their loss to the Turks. When? In 1389, at the Battle of Kosovo Polje, 28 years ago. Ukrainians and Russians debate whether the state founded as Kiev and Rus in the 9th century was a Ukrainian state or a Russian state. Bulgarians and Greeks deny the legitimacy of the Republic of Macedonia and the very existence of a Macedonian people, whereas the Macedonians have erected an enormous statue of Alexander the Great in Skopje, in the capital of Macedonia, claiming him as a Macedonian and never a Greek. A few weeks ago, at a session of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, a project led by Alti and Beryl Rodal, who are with us today from Ottawa, Beryl reminded us of what William Faulkner had written in Requiem for a Nun. The past is never dead. It's not even past. Indeed, history is a real issue with real-world consequences. Is Crimea part of Russia or Ukraine? Are Moldovans Romanians or a distinct people? Can Slavs and other non-autochthonous peoples be citizens of Latvia and Estonia? Is Nagorno-Karabakh Armenia or Azerbaijan? Is the West Bank of the Jordan River part of Israel or of a nascent Palestinian state? Was Hungary a victim of Nazism or a collaborator with it? Was neighboring Austria the, quote, first victim of Nazism, as they say, or were Austrians, including Hitler, perpetrators of Nazi atrocities? What about the Ukrainian insurgent army, which briefly fought both the Nazis and the Soviets, but then wiped out 40,000 Poles and a large number of Jews? Was that army fascist collaborators, as Russians would have it? Or Ukrainian national heroes, as former Ukrainian President Yushchenko maintained? Poland, Ukraine, the Czech and Slovak republics have established official institutes of national memory. Governments are careful to appoint the right people to them. The present government of Hungary, not pleased by the existing Holocaust Museum, established its own politically correct museum in 2014. That museum features the rescue of Jews by Hungarians, ignoring the anti-Semitic Hungarian governments of the late 1930s, Hungary's alliance with Nazi Germany's war effort, and the role of the native fascist organization, the Arrow Cross, Nyilas, in the murder and deportation of Hungarian Jews. Depending on the party in power, Polish governments have taken very different positions on the roles played by Poles in betraying and killing Jews during the 1940s and in protecting them at the same time, which is the theme to be emphasized. A related issue is the politics of monuments, and that has sometimes absurd dimensions. We all know that the monuments to communist leaders Lenin and Stalin in most places have been pulled down, while other monuments to figures reviled in communist times have been erected. In Poland, to the pre-war politicians Józef Piłsudski and Roman Dmowski, they were rivals, but now both stand proudly in the central squares. In Ukraine, to Stepan Bandera, leader of the Ukrainian insurgent army. To Monsignor Josef Tiso, a princeling of the church, but also head of the fascist state in Slovakia in the 1940s. And to Miklos Horthy, Hitler's ally in Hungary. They are regarded in some quarters as national heroes deserving of monumental commemoration. A well-known example of monumental revisionism is Babi Yar in Kiev. In September 29th and 30th, 1941, according to Nazi documentation, 33,771 Jews were shot in Babi Yar by the Nazis and local collaborators. There was no monument commemorating that event during Soviet times. The Holocaust was an inconvenient truth. The late Yevgeny Yevtushenko, with whom I was privileged to meet before he was famous and was wandering around Colombia, not able to find where he was supposed to go, dedicated a book of his poetry to me with the inscription, because he asked me, "What are you studying?" I said, "Political science." He says, "What's that?" I said, "Well, politics." "Ah!" And he inscribed it to Zvi, the next president of the United States. Years later, he and I were present at a conference at the University of Maryland. And I went up to him with the book and I said, "Zhenya, it didn't happen." He says, "Give me the book." And he wrote in English, "It's never too late." Well, in 1961, Yevtushenko became famous because he wrote this poem, Babi Yar, which begins with the words, "Over Babi Yar there is no monument." The great Russian composer, Dmitri Shostakovich, took the poem and included it in his 13th symphony. The symphony was played in Moscow. Khrushchev said, "Take it away. It's no good." It was excised from the Soviet repertoire. But in 1966, I happened to be present at the Leningrad premiere of the symphony, and 3 rows in front of me was sitting Yevtushenko, and this became a massive demonstration of Jewish solidarity by young people who had no other way of expressing their Jewishness but to come to a symphony which included a commemoration of Babi Yar. A decade later, 76, the Soviets reluctantly erected a socialist realist monument on the site. Jews were not mentioned in the inscription. Later, a small plaque in Yiddish was put on the site. I read it. The word Jew was not mentioned. But it was in Yiddish. So, Hamevin Yavin, as the Talmud says, he who understands will understand. How subtle. The plaque was in a Jewish language, which few could read, but no mention was made of the murdered speakers of that language. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there's been a veritable flood of monuments. A menorah-shaped monument in 1991. A year later, another monument. In 2000, a cross to 621 Ukrainian nationalists shot at Babi Yar by the Nazis. And then an oak cross to 2 Ukrainian Orthodox priests also shot there. In 2001, a monument to children. And in 2016, a monument to the Roma who were killed in the same place. And now there are discussions, and Alti, I guess you're very much involved in that, about building a museum and possibly some kind of community center on the site. I want to illustrate the politicization of monuments, if I can open this computer, with reference to another site. Kelsey, are you here still? No? Yeah, there you go. This is a site in Lithuania.
Someone turn it off.
Okay. This is a site in Lithuania. It's called Paniere in Lithuanian, Ponare in Polish, Panar in Russian. It's about an hour and a quarter ride outside of Vilnius, or Vilno, which was known as the Jerusalem of Lithuania, the main center of Litvak Jewry. And this is the site to which most of the Jews in the Vilnius ghetto were brought by the Nazis and their Lithuanian accomplices. About 100,000 people were machine gunned to death. We think that about 70,000 of them were Jews. There were some Poles, some Russian POWs, and others who also met their end in Paniere. Somebody was overzealous.
Someone turned off the computer.
So what I'm going to show you is, first of all, this site, just before the war, had been created as a series of fuel storage tanks, big round tanks, which became pits, and became a convenient place for killing lots of people and then burying their bodies. Okay, this is what happened. What they're doing is, these two guys are making sure that those who have fallen are really dead. These are the pits in which they were buried. One of 6 or 7, if I recall. This is the Soviet monument that was put up shortly after the war. You can't see the inscription, but it says nothing about the ethnicity of the victims. It's capped by a Soviet star. It's a typical Soviet socialist realist obelisk monument. Now it gets interesting. This is a monument that was put up during Perestroika, during the last period of Gorbachev's reforms. There had been a single monument with inscription in Lithuanian, inscription in Russian, and the monument said, I don't read Lithuanian, but in Russian it says, here in the forest, from July 41 till July of 44, the Hitlerite occupants and their local assistants killed 100,000 people. That word, their local assistance, was put up only in the late 1980s. After the fall of communism, these two segments were pulled apart. And in between was inserted this monument, or this stone, which says in Yiddish and in Hebrew that 41 to 44, the Hitlerite occupants and their local assistants killed 100,000 people, of whom 70,000 were Jews, men, women, and children. So you see an incremental change. First, there are 100,000 people killed by the Hitlerite occupants. Then Hitlerite occupants and their local helpers. Then of the 100,000, it is specified that 70,000 of them were Jews. But this is not enough. Comes along a survivor of the Vilna Ghetto, now living in Israel, Epstein, and he puts up his monument, which says in Hebrew and in Yiddish that the Nazis and their local helpers killed the Jews. This is a distinctly Jewish monument with Jewish symbols. The menorah, the Star of David. Finally, in the year 2000, the Poles erect their own monument. And of course, Polach to jest Katolik, a Pole is a Catholic, so you get a cross and a commemoration of the people of Polish nationality who were killed there. So what you see here is a progression and a revision over time of inscriptions and the messages that are sent to various publics by changing the monuments. Now, a few months ago in the United States, as you all remember, the controversy erupted about monuments. Did Americans suddenly care so much about history and its representation? Or was this a brief paroxysm of identity politics with no serious thought and deliberation, but rather emotional outbursts on all sides? The issue, in my view, was handled in such a puerile and knee-jerk fashion that a sportscaster of Korean ancestry, who had the misfortune to be named Robert Lee, was prevented by the ESPN Sports Network from broadcasting a University of Virginia game, lest his name, the same as, of course, as the Confederate leader, whose statues were to be demolished, would offend someone. But notice how quickly that whole discussion seems to have disappeared. Far weightier matters have occupied us. The president, for example, has been pondering such issues as ingratitude by shoplifting UCLA basketball players, or the need for a wall on the Mexican border in order to prevent further terrorist attacks in Egypt. And as he stated eloquently on the 22nd of November, quote, "If Hillary got my kid out of prison, as much as I hate the woman, I'd thank her corrupt ass." As this surely ranks with Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and his speech at the second inauguration. All right, to be sure, shallowness is not the monopoly of any part of the political spectrum. Looking at it from the perspective of the 1960s, the left has become as illiberal as they accuse the right of being. Both are frightened of free expression. The Michigan graduate student who forcibly prevented Charles Murray from speaking here was a hero to some, not to me. I recall the words of the law professor who addressed my freshman class at orientation, and he said roughly as follows: "If you enter this class and this college as a Republican, a football fan, and an economics major, And if at some point you do not contemplate being a Democrat, an aficionado of ballet, and a philosophy major, both you and the college will have failed. And that was a pretty shocking statement to a kid just out of yeshiva. Let me tell you. The university has to be a free marketplace of ideas, not a safe space for those who are afraid of confronting those ideas. It's a place where you should sometimes feel uncomfortable intellectually, not sheltered and protected. When the university administration, a number of years ago here, held a series of symposia on affirmative action, all the many panelists supported the idea. None dissented, though the issue was widely debated in the press, the courts, and the general public. I don't think that's the function of the university. And that's why I am pleased that President Schlissel and Dean Martin, who certainly do not share Richard Spencer's ideas as I do not, are considering allowing him, under certain circumstances, to speak on campus. Now, that's not a simple or an easy issue. I know that very well. Trigger warnings have already been issued. Spencer will surely commit more than one microaggression. But Kinderlach, the world is full of macroaggressions. It's a dangerous place. You can't hide from that. And hiding will not bring neither peace nor justice. Life is not an eternally safe space. In 1927, Mr. Justice Brandeis wrote that the response to bad speech is more speech, so that people may learn and debate and choose. As he said, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence. Or as Oliver Wendell Holmes said, free speech is not free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought we hate. Today we've become, some of us, of intersectionality. In 1903, in one of his articles, Lenin wrote, "He who says A must say B." Not a very profound philosophical observation. But that's what's happened in intersectionality. It means if you are for cause A, you must automatically be for cause B. That means you don't have to analyze an issue on its own merits, but follow, lemming-like, someone else's cause without necessarily knowing and certainly not thinking about it. Identity politics allows people to say, contra Descartes, I am, therefore I need not think. We've seen this recently in various campus events, which I won't detail. Identity politics have replaced solidarity. The mantra of diversity has made expressions of national or other kinds of solidarity, except gender and race for some, and rooting for a sports team for others, politically and socially incorrect. As a commentator wrote recently in the New York Times, we are retreating to our tribal, ethnic, and primitively prejudicial quarters. Everything is about race and identity. We come from privilege or we come from oppression. But let me conclude on a happier note. I am overwhelmed with gratitude for the great opportunities given to me over half a century by the University of Michigan. I do have a rather thick folder which is labeled Michigan Narrigkeit. Michigan nonsense in Yiddish. The halo put up around the Michigan Stadium. Some of you remember. And then taken down at considerable cost, though the halo did accurately reflect a cardinal belief in Ann Arbor. Football is both angelic and holy. M-quality, you remember that? A president announcing that he would abandon the menacing fortress-like Fleming building and move to be closer to the students in the Mason Angel Haven complex. So we had to move out of Haven Hall, and it never happened. The exponential growth in the number of administrators and their salaries. Sorry, Dean. A national plague of corporatization of university. The debacle of administrative services transformation for which we paid millions of dollars to a consulting firm in Chicago, which sent in 21-year-old consultants fresh out of school to teach us how to communicate and do other things which we all knew how to do. All right. Look, the truth is, there's plenty of Narishkeit, there's plenty of nonsense among us academics. Take, for example, in the workshop in the Department of American Culture here. He's a postdoctoral fellow at the National Center for Institutional Diversity, and I quote what his topic was. He teased out the theoretical and epistemic possibilities of Marlon Fuentes' compositional on-screen surface strategies that are driven by Fuentes' counter-archival ethos, the film's conceptual depth in Bontoc eulogy. Get it? And to be fair, it's not just cultural studies and the humanities. A book just published in Political Science, International Relations, is called Post-Human Dialogues in International Relations. So I looked through the table of contents. There's a chapter devoted to worm politics. Worm politics. There's another one called Fish and International Relations. Well, we had to put up with postmodernism, so why not posthumanism? No, seriously. I regret that the University of Michigan has become a rich man's school. The median income of students' parental households is $154,000. The national median is $59,000. I had a student in the 1970s who regularly fell asleep in class. Well, he wasn't the only one, but this guy was particularly egregious. So I called him in, I said, "What's the matter?" He says, "Listen, professor, I'm working 40 hours a week at the automobile plant in Ypsilanti. I don't have such students anymore. I'm sorry about that. But I am encouraged that the university is becoming increasingly cognizant of it, and perhaps in the not too distant future it will become once again what President James B. Angel said it should be, namely to offer an uncommon education to the common man." As I've tried to persuade my long-suffering wife, children, and grandchildren, as well as my students, I criticize when I care. I've loved my nearly half-century here. I owe an unrepayable debt to a great university, a great department, the Frankel Center, Center for Russian and East European Studies, to librarians, secretaries, technical specialists, look what just happened, and many others. My greatest debt, and I mean this seriously, is to my students. The Talmud quotes Rabbi Hanina, who says as follows, "Harbe lamadati mirabotai, umechaverai yoter mirabotai, umitalmidai yoter mikulan." I have learned a great deal from my teachers, more from my colleagues, and the most from my students. My students have challenged me, inspired me, delighted me. I am at least the fourth successive generation in my family to be a teacher, albeit the first in a university. What a privilege, what a joy that has been. Thank you all so very much.